Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in and stopping by to check out this video. In this video I'm going to show you how to change the front fork oil in a 2017 Honda Rebel. This bike comes from the factory with 10 weight oil and the front suspension is really soft. I'm going to install a 15 weight oil to see if I can stiffen up the front end a bit. I attached a ruler to the front fork just to see how much travel I was getting with the 10 weight oil. I'm going to do the same after I install the 15 weight oil to see if there's any reduction in travel. This isn't meant to be scientific or anything, but just to give me a ballpark estimate. So I ended up with 2 3/8 inches of travel with the 10 weight oil.
Alright, so let me show you how to remove the front forks now.
The first thing you're going to want to do is jack up the bike. Now I realize this can be tricky. I happen to have some crash bars that I bought from T-Rex Racing that make for a great point to jack the bike up and slip some jack stands underneath. You see the ladder in the background, and I did try that first and I put it over the bike and used some tie straps that have winches on them and attempted to pull the bike up that way, but the ladder was not strong enough and it ended up buckling a little bit. If you have rafters in a garage, you could use this system and that would probably work very well, or you can try to jack it up from the foot pegs. Next, you're going to want to remove the front axle bolt. This isn't on there super tight, so just a normal ratchet will do fine. Next, remove the axle pinch bolts. I ended up removing these, which isn't necessary. All you have to do is loosen them and you can leave them in the fork. That's just fine. Go to the other side and do the same thing. And don't worry about the axle. We're actually going to tap that out in a minute. I remove these. Again, you don't have to. You can just leave them in, just loosen them. Next, remove the brake caliper. And these bolts do have Loctite on them, so when you reinstall them, make sure that you add a little bit of Loctite. You can see it right there, it's coming off a little bit. Next, you want to get a bungee cord, a string, or a bucket, something to support the brake caliper so that it doesn't hang by its own weight from the hose. I took a bungee and went over the front handlebar and connected it to the brake lever, and that worked out fine. Next, take your axle bolt and screw it in slightly and just take a hammer and just tap it to get the axle started going out. I found that a 3/8 extension worked perfect for this, and just tap the axle out the rest of the way. Just enough to get your hand on it. Support the wheel and then just pull the axle out. You'll notice on the front wheel there are 2 spacers on each side. You just want to take these off and just set them aside. Next, we're going to remove the front fender. And there's 4 bolts. These bolts also have Loctite on them as well. And behind that bolt I'm unscrewing, there is a bracket that attaches to the brake hose. So when you're reinstalling it, just make sure that you attach that bracket as well. Take all the bolts out and the fender slides right off. Next thing you want to do is loosen the fork cap. There's no reason to take these off entirely right now. You're just loosening them because the bridge is actually holding them, which makes it a lot easier to unscrew it. Next, loosen the bridge pinch bolts. No need to take these out, just loosen them. And this will allow you to slide the front fork out. Just like that. Do the same thing on the other side. Loosen the 2 bolts. And it's not a bad idea to put a towel on your tank when you're working so you don't get any scratches. Ask me how I know about that. And that's it. Forks are removed. So we got the two front forks, the front fender, the front wheel, the fender bolts, the axle bolt, the axle, the two spacers, the brake caliper bolts, and the axle pinch bolt. Next, remove the fork cap, and just be careful. It's under tension, so it'll pop off. Also lay down some cardboard because there's going to be some oil when you're pulling out the parts, and you don't want to stain your driveway or anything like that. So pull out the plastic spacer, and next pull out the spring. It's going to be covered in oil, so just be ready. And note the orientation of the spring, how it's more coiled at the bottom than it is at the top. Pour the oil into a container. I believe there's 14.8 ounces of fork oil in the forks. You want to pump it a few times to get as much as you can out of the dampener. You're not going to get it all out, but pump it a few times, you'll get most of it out. So I'm going with Maxima 15 weight fork oil. This is what the guys at Revzilla recommended. A liter I think is about 15 bucks, not expensive at all. So I'm measuring 6.5 inches down from the top of the fork when it's fully compressed. This is what the service manual calls for. And just measure down and keep pouring in the fork oil until it's at the desired height. You can use a fork oil level gauge, which has a little ring on it, and you set it to the desired length, and then there's a little kind of a pump where you can suck out the remaining fork oil. I didn't have one of those, and I didn't want to buy one of those, so I just decided to do this method, and it worked just fine. All right, so just keep checking with the ruler, and once you have it set, stick in the spring with the more compressed side first, and then put in the plastic spacer, and now you can pull up the fork and reattach the fork cap. And when you're screwing this in, just be careful of the O-ring. It has a tendency to bind a little bit, so just make sure that it goes in straight and it doesn't tear. And just repeat that on the other fork. Now you want to slide the fork in through the lower bridge, through the turn signal, and through the upper bridge. And then just get these snug just so that the fork doesn't fall out. Next, check to ensure the fork tube is at the proper height in the bridge. This is simple. Just make sure the top of the fork tube, not the fork cap, is flush with the top of the bridge. You can see the red arrow, and it shows that it's completely flush. Once you have the fork tube properly aligned, then you can go ahead and make the bridge bolts a little bit tighter. Go ahead and repeat the process on the other side, sliding it through the lower bridge, through the turn signal, and into the upper bridge. Make sure to line it up properly so that the top of the fork tube, not the cap, is level with the bridge. It's kind of tight getting your wrench in here. Be careful you don't scratch the handlebars. And just snug these up. I couldn't get my torque wrench in here, but the torque is not high at all. It's just making it nice and snug. And there you go. Okay, so you can take a minute and just straighten them out a little bit. We're going to torque everything down later. Add some Loctite to the fender bolts and go ahead and get the front fender into position. Line up your first bolt and get it started. So here's the brake hose bracket I was telling you about earlier. Just make sure that goes in, and then feed the bolt through the fender and that bracket as well. Go ahead and put your other two bolts in. My gloves had torn at this part, and I didn't have any extras, so that's why I'm not wearing any gloves right now. Go ahead and grab your brake caliper and line that up. Don't forget to add Loctite to these bolts. And go ahead and install them and just make them snug. Grab your front wheel. Don't forget to put the spacers on each side and take a little bit of grease and just apply it to the axle. I think I put on a little bit too much here because it was coming out of the sides when I went to install the axle. So just support the front wheel and slide the axle in. You'll have to wiggle it back and forth just to kind of get it started, but eventually it'll go in. And then support it from the other side and just take a hammer or a mallet and just tap it home. Make sure it spins, obviously. Install your axle bolt. And then your axle pinch bolts. Do this on each side. Okay, now go ahead and grab your torque wrench. And you can torque these down to 16 foot-pounds or 22 Newton meters for the axle pinch bolts. Do it on both sides. This is actually a 1/4 inch torque wrench that I'm using because my hex socket was 1/4 inch, but you can do this with a 1/2 inch. Go ahead and torque your axle bolt. This is 38 foot-pounds or 51 Newton meters. Next, torque your brake caliper bolts. 22 foot-pounds or 30 Newton meters. A lot of these bolts on the bike are not torqued very tight, so it's definitely important to use a torque wrench. Now the top bridge bolt and the bottom bridge bolt have different torque specs. The top one is 20 and the bottom one is 24, so just be aware of that. Okay, so now let's check the travel with the 15 weight oil. I have the ruler reinstalled, and let's see what the reduction is. Okay, so 2 2/16 or 2 1/8 total travel. All right, so let's wrap this up and see what we got. So with the 10 weight oil, we had a total travel of 2.375. I just converted this to decimal points instead of fractions. With 15 weight, we had 1.875, so that is a total reduction of 1/2 inch. The 1/2 inch may not seem like much, but when I took the bike for a test drive, I noticed that the bike definitely wasn't bottoming out on bad bumps like it had in the past. The front suspension was still on the soft side, but with that said, I felt there was a marginal improvement from the stock 10 weight oil. As soon as I can get my hands on an Ohlins or YSS spring kit, I will definitely be installing one of them on the bike, and be sure to make a video to let you guys know if there is an improvement with aftermarket springs. So what do you think about the front suspension on the Honda Rebel? Would you install an aftermarket spring kit or consider swapping to a heavier weight fork oil? Let me know in the comments. I hope this video helped you out. If it did, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next one.